Good morning. I've been going on about A Christmas Carol for some time now because I have recently published an article about that. And this won't go on forever. The next article is about Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven, and then I'll be going on about that quite a bit. But I'm going to save that until, I think 1st of August, somewhere around there is probably when I'll release the paper after it's been published, and I've waited about a month. But I've got one more thing about Dickens here. Matthew was a reporter, and for extra cash, he would submit just little bits, reviews, sometimes book reviews, or sometimes just little essays, things like that. And they're unsigned, so I haven't really emphasized them very much in my books and in my presentation, but I thought I'd go into a couple of them today. I am personally pretty much convinced that Matthew was the author of these for quite a number of reasons. It's very difficult to prove. It's style, it's an intuition, it's having been exposed to so much of Matthew's work and knowing how his mind works and knowing his style and knowing his history of a relationship with these different newspapers. So we're going to turn to the Boston Weekly Museum of January 20, 1849. Now, I don't have a physical copy of this. I have microfilm copies or JPEGs made from microfilm, and I'll put them up on the screen here as I read. So I'll be reading from a piece of paper that I printed out. This is a review of Dickens' Christmas story, The Haunted Man or the Ghost's Bargain. And again, I'm 99.9% sure this is written by Matthew, and I have to give a little bit of background. I'm not going to stretch this out too much this morning. Matthew had long time been a fan of Dickens, which I know from personal letters with his brother, going way back to the early 1840s. And he had handed over his and Abby's manuscript after Abby's passing to Dickens, from which Dickens fashioned A Christmas Carol. I can prove that beyond a reasonable doubt and have done so in my paper. I'm now kind of discussing and arguing that point with scholars online, which I won't go into. And Matthew continued to be a fan, but I think he was suspicious. He just didn't know quite what to make of Dickens. And I think the reason for that is, first of all, that Dickens pretended to be a much more honorable man than he really was, and had that reputation of being a more honorable man than he really was. And secondly, because he was such a rampant plagiarist, far more than anybody suspected, and certainly far more than Matthew suspected. So with a plagiarist, you have a problem. If you accept that he was the author of certain works, then you have to give him his due, not just as a writer, but as a man and in terms of his spirituality. If he plagiarized those things, it's a whole different conclusion, see? So there's that confusion because he was assuming that Dickens had actually originated things that he actually had just reworked or sensationalized. Now is how I feel now about it. So he would go back and forth. But here's one thing that Matthew definitely knew, and that was that Dickens did not have the authority to write about spiritual topics. He was not a spiritual man. He didn't have a deep understanding of metaphysics or the paranormal. And he had no business trying to replicate the story that Matthew had given him as though it was all his. That's as far as Matthew would take it. Just, leave this stuff alone because that was Abby's. In other words, the spirituality in A Christmas Carol was Abby's. And Matthew was feeling a bit peeved, I think, at Dickens for insinuating that he could have written that. He was just beginning to catch on, I think, to Dickens' hypocrisy. So what I'm going to read here is this little review, which I believe Matthew wrote. I'll read it straight through. I'll make some comments. And then I've got one more little essay that bears on this. And then we're done for the day. Incidentally, the one I did last, reading a story by Matthew, which is, by my lights, a precursor to A Christmas Carol, I rambled on for about 20 minutes before I got to that. And it makes me wonder how many people actually listen to the story itself, which starts about 20 minutes into the presentation, because that's real proof Now, the academicians that I'm having contact with online, they all want to do a textual analysis. They all want to analyze the text the way that the scholars have analyzed the Bible to see who wrote which sections when and so on. Well, I've done that. I've got a clear precursor to A Christmas Carol. When I say clear, I'm not just farting around with that. I mean, it's a clear, obvious precursor to A Christmas Carol if it was written before A Christmas Carol was published, which I have XXX evidence for. Has anybody watched that? Because the skeptics say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but it's a lie. It's all hypocrisy because they refused to look at the evidence when you provide it. They're arrogantly assuming that you can't provide it. So therefore they say that off the cuff. Oh, extraordinary evidence, I know you can't provide extraordinary evidence, for extraordinary claims. So therefore I'll say this thing. Should you provide that evidence, they'll go into denial and won't look at it. And they'll make all kinds of excuses. They're too busy, Yeah. So it's hypocrisy. All right, so here we go. Dickens' Christmas Story. The last Christmas tale by Boz is for sale by Reading and Company and by Saxton's State Street, and is entitled The Haunted Man or the Ghost's Bargain. We have read it and commend it. It has a moral and is appropriate for the occasion for which it was written. The design of the author is to prove that to forget our sorrows and wrongs would be a misery to us, that memory of these, though it causes us to murmur, is yet a blessing, since it binds us more closely to our friends, keeping alive their good deeds and teaching us to be therefore more charitable to their errors. The tale is well told, and though standing in the same category with many of Dickens' later works, which are not so uniformly fresh and brilliant as his earlier ones, those are the ones he plagiarized, by the way, yet it has several strong examples of his peculiar humor and pathos, and these, though they are but occasional, well pay with the moral for the time expended in perusing the work. The work is an unpretending one, is brief, and was doubtless written in a day or two, so it would be absurd to make an elaborate criticism upon it. But we will venture one opinion upon a fault of which its author is guilty in this as in other of his works. We mean where he attempts to be mysteriously sublime. There he is utterly and ludicrously out of his element, and stands in pitiable contrast to Bulwer Lytton. There is little of the lofty in the composition of Boz. He handles it in a most clumsy manner. He knocks at the temple door of the oracle, but she is froward, and he only bruises his fist. It is to his humor and pathos and expressive delineations of uncouth character that he should solely stick, and leave profundity and attempts to awe to those of a more spiritual turn. I think the message is clear enough. And Matthew has become so bold because he's defending Abby, because he knows that the real spirituality in A Christmas Carol came from Abby, and that Dickens' attempt to be spiritual and be metaphysical is a slap in the face to Abby, when he shouldn't be effectively claiming the entire piece. See? So now, the mouse over there, we have a volume of the 1850 Portland Transcript, which I have here, a physical volume. I've got it in, this is archival plastic, but it's not the kind you're supposed to use. It's the kind you use for sleeves. And it's just what I happen to have. Now here, this is the December 28th, 1850 edition. So we're talking, roughly a year later. Now this is the first indication I have had. I realize I didn't put one of my lights on, so it's going to be a little change in lighting here. I'm bringing down the light so that I can read here. This is the first indication I had that Matthew was beginning to take the idea of reincarnation seriously. When Abby was trying to teach him many years earlier, he was absolutely skeptical about it. And then he became a Swedenborgian, a follower of Emanuel Swedenborg, who did not teach reincarnation, kind of a spiritualist teaching. And then he became a spiritualist in the 1850s. And by no means all spiritualists accepted reincarnation at the time, nor still do, although I think gradually they're coming around. If you really press any of the famous psychics, they'll grudgingly and briefly admit that they believe in it, and then they'll move on quickly because they're waiting for the Spiritualist Association to come down on them, I think. That's because spiritualism came largely from Christianity, see? So they still have retained that prejudice against reincarnation. Now, this very clearly makes references to reincarnation, although it doesn't directly cite it. I don't believe. We'll see when we get in, but I think he never uses the word or transmigration or anything like that, but he talks about preexistence. So this is titled Preexistence, and I probably will stop periodically and comment on this. Through what brain, in which a thought e'er found lodgment, has not sometimes floated a dim consciousness of a past existence? A flash of light, a momentary glance, a struggling reminiscence, and all was blank again. Sometimes it came to us in the strains of sweetest music. Sometimes it was awakened by a look, a word, a thought. Mostly in the dim hour of twilight, when the inward eye sees more clearly than amid the bustle of the world, such glimpses of the past, such haunting, tantalizing visions have startled us. Visions quickly fading, and yet leaving a firm though unsatisfied impression. Boatswain Chip, I don't know what that references to, Boatswain Chip was ready to swear that what he did today, he had done 1,000 years before. It's a literary reference, I'm sure. I just have to look it up. Most of us are not so sure, and yet the thought has risen that we have lived other lives than this and left them far behind us. Well, that's clearly reincarnation there. We do not care to philosophize about it. We will indulge the vision. Other men have done so before us, and beautiful fancies they have fashioned therefrom. To the ancients, as to us, came such thoughts, and with their rich imaginations they painted a glorious past in the history of man. Plato beautifully shadowed forth the doctrine of the soul's antenatal life. Now, I'll mention here that Abby included the Greek philosophers in her tutoring in her curriculum of Matthew when she tutored him early on, passed on her privately tutored education to him. So Matthew would, of course, have read Plato, and Abby would have specifically emphasized that. Plato beautifully shadowed forth the doctrine of the soul's antenatal life, and the Greeks imagined that the Milky Way was the path down which our souls had descended in their earthward journey. Now, this is something skeptics do. They look at anybody's teaching or a past culture's teaching, and because they are skeptical, they play straw man. They look for that parts of the myth which they know are fanciful, probably originally created by other skeptics back in the day, see? So when somebody who back in the day didn't have a clear grasp of this started making up fancies about the Milky Way being the path, now the modern day skeptic, saying the 1800s is modern day, latches on to that past skeptic's muddy understanding and tries to discount the entire thing with it. That's straw man, logically, picking the worst, the weakest point and pouncing on it. So anyway, Matthew was indulging in straw because he's half a skeptic here still. See? At Crater, the starry cup between the constellations Leo and Cancer, the exiled spirits were compelled to take an oblivious draught that they might bear with them to earth no memory of the paradise behind. Yet, as the quaint old Macrobius says, the soul is not extinguished by its banishment, but occasionally awakens to glimpses of the past. So too the Egyptians, in the secret recesses of their temples, were taught by their priests, quote, that men were spirits fallen from a brighter sphere, and that the reason they brought with them no reminiscence of that preexistence was because one of the genii stood at the gate of human life, with a Lethean cup in his hand, from which each soul was compelled to take an oblivious draught, on recovering from which there flitted before it but dim, broken, and fragmentary visions of the past. And amongst these broken visions, music was the chief. Thus the Hindu sage suggests that, quote, the sadness of men on seeing beautiful forms and listening to sweet melody arises from some faint remembrance of past joys and the traces of connections in a former state of existence. These were the fancies of the men of old. Now his skeptic kicks in again. See? We live in an age which does not indulge in fancies, and yet there come to us still these glimpses of a better land, dim memories of an antenatal life. Sage philosophy may assign them other than a celestial origin, but we care not to listen to it. We will cherish the visions until the mysteries of life are laid open to us. So as a skeptic, he's back and forth. He's on the fence here. And he ends up with, the materialistic philosophers may assign it to an earthly cause, but we'll cherish the visions until the mysteries of life are laid open to us. He's going to keep an open mind. Now think about the meta aspect of this. You realize that the person that wrote this is now sitting before you, having explored this question deeply and coming up with the positive confirmation of it. Not only in terms of I believe it, but I've proven it. Okay? So I am now reading you my 19th century beginning foray into this field, which I have now explored to the full in 2021. I think that's interesting. Nobody else may think it's interesting. The last entry here so far has gotten 9 views. And we don't know how many people stuck out my rambling for the first 20 minutes in my commentary to get down to the actual meat of the evidence that I was providing. 9 people. Look at these YouTube channels. How many people are, subscribed to these YouTube channels? Praveen Mohan, the Indian fellow who goes around and visits Indian temples and does beautiful work, not to put him down in any way, but he recently hit 1 million followers. I have 9, or maybe 35 tops, I think. Why is that? Is it me? Is there something about me? I'm just boring, or I'm just, stupid looking or something? What is it? Well, I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that. I do know that reincarnation is the toughest sell in the entire panoply of New Age ideas. It's the toughest one. And I don't know why that should be, except for 2 reasons. I think reincarnation, well, it's resisted because of Christianity, because St. Paul took it out, and, various and sundry rulers after that. It's resisted because you can't cling to materialism anymore. This is a materialistic society and a materialistic economy. And should everybody realize that we are spiritual beings having a physical experience, the emphasis would be off acquiring material things. And the economy would take a hit. Probably there'd be service industries that would go up probably, but past life regression, things like that. But the economy would be profoundly altered, let's put it that way. It's also, I think, resisted because it means, if you bring karma into it, it means 100% accountability. And the people who don't want to be accountable for their actions are relieved that they managed to get Christianity out of the way, to discredit Christianity and the idea of hell and sin and all those things. All that's been disproven as a bunch of hokum, see now, and they're very happy to be able to do any damn thing they want to. Reincarnation brings it right back again. 100% accountability for everything you do, based on motive, but still, I don't think they want that. Because they're going to have to seriously re-examine their actions and their motives. And this society is so shallow and so materialistic that it does not want to examine its actions nor its motives. it had better do so, because what it's doing now is not sustainable. But, you know, anyway, I think this is kind of interesting. I'm going to end this now and go ahead and edit it. There'll be a little bit of editing to do to get the images of the articles in, and then I'll go ahead and post it. And probably I won't do a whole lot more on Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. I would suggest reading my paper, which you can find in the updates page of this website. And I don't know how many more of these I'll do or what I'll share. I'm still practicing one or two pieces on the piano that I would like to play more or less in their entirety as they're supposed to be played. But I haven't gotten to the point where I can do that yet, especially not when I'm recording myself. So that may be a while. And then comes the article or paper on The Raven and Edgar Allan Poe. And then I'm going to make a serious push about that one and probably do quite a few entries about that. But that's 3 months down the road. So anyway, we'll see what occurs to me.